Welcome to day 4 of the Novel Challenge. My name is Brad Pauquette, and today we are going to talk about characters. Did you know that there are 7 character archetypes that you have been seeing in stories over and over and over again? Well, it's true. And I'm going to show you what those archetypes are today. And, we're doing like an abbreviated version for these videos for the novel challenge, just so you can do them succinctly. You can get the information you need and you can keep moving forward. That's my heart for you. And this one is probably, as far as the teaching lessons go here in the first week of the novel challenge, this is probably the easiest one to do that for because I can just walk down the list and I can tell you what these characters are. However, in the interest of time, it requires that you take my word for it. So, if you'd like some of the explanation as far as why these characters are important, why we need them, kind of the psychology behind these characters, or you want additional examples of these characters represented in popular stories so that you kind of connect the dots, then, of course, check out the Novel Matrix book and the classes on the company's website. But nonetheless, we're going to talk through these 7 character archetypes. And what I want to note first, though, is that while we do see this sort of archetypical character for each of these 7, it's actually the function of the character that is most important. So we'll touch on this as we go. But not every story necessarily contains all 7 of these characters, but they will contain a character that does the things that we're talking about. So the cast of characters is your protagonist, which is your main character. Then you also have a guide, a sidekick, a frenemy, an object of affection, an antagonist, and a mega antagonist. And those are the 7 character archetypes that we're going to discuss today. So let's start with the protagonist. The protagonist is your main character. I think we're all familiar enough with main characters that that'll make sense to you, but they're the person that's going to drive your story. What's important about the protagonist is that they cannot be a perfect person. A lot of times we imagine our protagonist as sort of a better version of ourselves, or they're sort of ourselves. We're the protagonist. However, since we're writing the story, we have this perfect knowledge and experience of the universe. So the protagonist sort of becomes the person that we would be if we knew everything about the universe and we could perfectly predict exactly what was going to happen. But just like you, my friend, your protagonist must have problems. Your protagonist must be morally flawed, must sometimes make morally gray decisions or cross a boundary. And that's going to help you thematically. A lot of times we think, well, if we make our character bad, our protagonist bad, then the reader won't like them. However, that's not true. Tell me this. Do you know any perfect people in your life? But I assume you still have people you like regardless, right? So you know imperfect people and you like them. Now, have you ever met anybody who's like too perfect? It's actually harder to like that person sometimes, right? So turns out that your readers are imperfect as well, and they tend to relate to other imperfect characters. So your protagonist is obviously important because they're going to carry the story. Secondly, and I'm just going to go down the list that's here in chapter 6 of the Novel Matrix. Second character we need to discuss is the guide. So stereotypically, the guide is sort of like this old man figure that will give advice to the protagonist. But here's the important functions of the guide, and really any character could potentially fulfill this. It could be a young person, could be, it has to be able to talk and be intelligent and things like that, but it could be like an intelligent animal. It could be whatever you need it to be. But what the guide does, the function of the guide is he explains the universe of the story to the reader. So your story exists in a universe that has rules and it has peculiarities. There are things about the universe that are interesting. The guide is the character that the reader trusts to just explain those things. So, for instance, Obi-Wan Kenobi in Star Wars just explains outright to Luke what the Force is. He says it's in us and around us and blah, blah, blah. And so the guide has this, we tolerate the guide just explaining things to us because we trust him. So that's function 1. Second function of the guide is that he helps the protagonist to establish their mission. So the protagonist is going to do an impossible thing, and the guide is the one that kind of shoves them in that direction. The protagonist doesn't always have to take the guide's advice at first. Sometimes that's part of the epiphany moment, at the end of the second act is that the protagonist starts doing the thing that the guide told them to do in the beginning of the story. But nonetheless, the guide, at least, even if the protagonist doesn't do it, the guide helps the reader to see what the protagonist ought to be doing. So in the case of Star Wars, we see Obi-Wan Kenobi literally invite Luke on this secret mission to save the princess, etc., etc. Um, the next character that we'll discuss is the sidekick. Everybody needs a little help. Nobody does things on their own. What's interesting is if your protagonist can do something, if they have a skill, a tool, a resource, your reader expects to know where they got that. So if your protagonist can fly a plane, your reader wants to know why. Were they in the Air Force? Did they fly? Did their dad have their license? So they just always grew up flying planes. Why does this protagonist know how to fly a plane? If your protagonist is an expert marksman, same thing. Character wants to know why. If your protagonist writes beautiful love sonnets to finally woo his love interest at the end, your reader wants to know how they know how to do that. Where they got that skill, what that's about. That has to be well developed. What's interesting about your sidekick is that for some reason, your reader doesn't care. Your sidekick provides tools, skills, resources, relationships. Whatever your protagonist needs, your sidekick just shows up with it. And what's very, very interesting is that the reader hardly ever asks, how do they know how to do that? Where did they get that? If the sidekick brings it, we just accept that it's there. R2D2 is a great example of this in Star Wars. When Luke is stuck in a trash compactor, surprise, surprise, R2D2 has a little thing that he can plug into the computer and make it all better. When Luke's X-Wing plane thing gets hit by Darth Vader or whoever, R2D2 has conveniently is in the back and has this little arm that he can reach out and fix the flappy thing on Luke's plane. And it's exceedingly convenient to the story that R2D2 can do these things, and we could continue on with that list. But nonetheless, he's the sidekick, so he just gets to show up and do that. Another great example is Sala in Indiana Jones and the Raiders of the Lost Ark. So Sala is the Egyptian man that helps Indy as they're digging for the Ark, and Sala can just come up with whatever he needs. If Indy needs a translation of the medallion, Sala knows a guy who can do that. If Indy needs a crew of guys to dig a hole, Sala can show up with that. If Indy needs a pack of camels, to get to the next scene, Sala can just magically appear on screen and have those things. And again, for whatever psychological reason, we just accept that the sidekick is allowed to bring that kind of assistance. The third character that we always see is a frenemy. And the function of the frenemy is to introduce a variable onto the scene. So the sidekick, when the sidekick shows up on the scene, we know the sidekick is imperfect as well, and the sidekick can make mistakes, but we always know that the sidekick is doing their best to help the protagonist. The sidekick is fundamentally loyal to the protagonist, to a fault even sometimes. The frenemy, we're not so sure about. When the frenemy shows up on the scene, we don't know if they're going to help or hurt the situation. So Han Solo is a great example of this. Han Solo literally saves the day at the end of Star Wars, but other times he can completely wreck everything. And we see so much potential in Han Solo. We wish that he would be a friend of Luke Skywalker, but he's just so morally gray and compromised that we never know exactly what he's going to do. And so the frenemy introduces this unknown variable and an element of surprise to the scene. Frenemies can be positive or negative. So Han Solo, and really most frenemies, are negative. We know that Han Solo is extremely talented and could be helpful, but we just don't trust him as a character. Sometimes, though, we see positive frenemies, which are characters that are very loyal to the protagonist, but are just such a screw up that they usually make things worse. Sometimes they have to make things better, but usually they're just gonna mess it up. Peeta is an example of this in the Hunger Games. He is in love with Katniss, and because of his loyalty to her, he creates a situation in which she must kill him, right? And so every time that Peeta is introduced, sometimes he's helpful, but we never know if he's actually going to help Katniss or if he's going to mistakenly make things worse. So we've covered the guide, the sidekick, and the frenemy. And now the The fourth character is the object of affection. So in early versions of the novel Matrix, when I was teaching this years and years ago, I called this the love interest. However, that's too narrow of a description, so I've changed the name to object of affection. And this is a character that catalyzes the protagonist to action. And that's really the function. The object of affection is able to get the protagonist to do really dumb things. And you could probably relate to that. Maybe you have somebody in your life that, for whatever reason, when they call, you will do the dumb thing even when you know that you shouldn't. And so, oftentimes, especially in like a very conventional sense, this is a love interest. It's a romantic interest of the protagonist, but it certainly doesn't have to be. So, Princess Leia is the object of affection in Star Wars. You know, Luke is catalyzed to his original mission. Obi-Wan invites him and he doesn't really want to go, but he sees Princess Leia and that kind of seals the deal. Now he's willing to do it. And we see that several times through this story when there are times that Luke could sort of just exit the situation and be done with it, or maybe solve his problem in another way. Princess Leia can bat her eyes and he will go back into danger rather than towards safety. A good example of an object of affection that isn't a love interest is Gone in 60 Seconds. So in Gone in 60 Seconds, Memphis Reigns is the main character played by Nicolas Cage, and his little brother Kip gets in trouble with the mafia. And so despite Memphis trying to live this straight life, he's done with crime and the cops are keeping an eye on him. Rather than maintaining that straight life, he jumps back into this criminal syndicate in order to save his little brother, when otherwise he would have been just fine. So the object of affection sort of catalyzes the protagonist to take actions that they otherwise wouldn't have taken. And so we've got the protagonist, and then we have those four good guys that help: the guide, the sidekick, the frenemy, and the object of affection. Now we also have bad guys. No story is complete without bad guys. So first we have an antagonist. And remember yesterday we talked about a little world and a big world, right? Little world conflicts and big world conflicts. The antagonist is the central force of evil in the little world. And even if you're writing literary fiction, you still need a bad guy. Stories without bad guys don't have conflicts. They might have tension, they might have challenges, but they don't have conflicts. So it might not be a literal evil man, twirling his mustache in the corner, but nonetheless, we do need somebody who is going to directly oppose the antagonist. That could be completely related to the protagonist's own insecurities and issues with himself. It could be the protagonist's boss is the antagonist. And maybe the boss is really a nice guy in his own right, but nonetheless, he is a cog in the system that stands against the protagonist. So he embodies that conflict. He's the other side of that tension in the conflict. Oftentimes, even in like an action adventure sense, the antagonist is himself a victim of the system. That's what we see with Darth Vader, who is the antagonist in Star Wars. Now, Darth Vader is a bad guy, right? But he has also been manipulated by the Emperor in his own right. And so we need that antagonist on the screen. I don't care what genre you're writing. We need an antagonist on the screen who will directly oppose the objectives of the protagonist. Remember what we talked about in conflicts. The protagonist and the antagonist either want the same thing and only one of them can have it. That'd be a typical feature of some romance stories. They would be pursuing the same love interest. Or the protagonist and antagonist have diametrically opposed goals. They can't both have the thing that they want, such as Luke Skywalker wants to destroy the Death Star and Darth Vader wants it to stay intact. So the antagonist embodies the little world conflicts. And then we have a mega antagonist, a bigger bad guy, if you will, that embodies the big world conflicts. So in the case of Star Wars, that would be the Emperor. And the thing about the antagonist, the little world antagonist, is that if we defeat the little world antagonist, chances are pretty good that there's going to be another bad guy just down the road, right? In the case of Star Wars, if Darth Vader died in the first book or in the first movie, rather than just being shot off into space to return for the second movie, if Darth Vader had died, there'd be another bad guy that the Emperor replaced him with for the second story. Um, However, the big world, the mega antagonist, if you could defeat that bad guy, it would result in real systemic change in the universe. So those two people groups that we identify in the big world external conflict, usually one of them is led by the mega antagonist. So again, in Star Wars, the Emperor leads the Empire. And if you were to kill or defeat the Emperor, then real change would occur, like lasting change would occur for the entire universe, rather than just the temporary reprieve that we get when Darth Vader is destroyed in the first story. So, again, we have the protagonist, and he has four helpers. He has a guide, a sidekick, a frenemy, and an object of affection. And then we have two bad guys. We have an antagonist and a mega antagonist. And what's more important than those specific characters are that those character functions are represented in the story. So in some cases, we can even combine character functions. In the book, you'll find a complete chart of which character functions can be combined. But for instance, something that we often see is that the guide and the object of affection have been combined. This is the case for Morpheus in The Matrix. He's the guide. He explains the universe. He helps Neo to understand Neo's mission. But Morpheus also continually gets in trouble, and Neo takes unnecessary risks over and over again to save Morpheus. And so those two character functions have been combined. We still have the guide who is going to explain the universe and provide the mission. And we still have the object of affections function, which is to catalyze the protagonist to do really dumb things. But one character can do all of those things at the same time. So, however you work your story, your character list might be smaller than 7, but make sure that all of those functions are represented in a compatible way, and you'll have a great story that audiences can relate to, believe, and understand. So, tomorrow we're going to talk about the last element that's really important for your novel planning, which is the universe. And this is really a deep well, surprisingly deep well that people underestimate as far as your ability to satisfactorily develop themes that resonate with your readers. So today, your assignment is to take those 3 ideas you've been developing and think about what kind of people would support this character. Who is he hanging around with? Is there a guide who could help explain the universe, or who would set him in motion on his mission? Is there an object of affection, somebody that, for whatever reason, just makes them do stupid things? And really importantly, especially if you're writing in a genre that we don't typically associate with bad guys like literary fiction, nonetheless, who are the real characters that you can bring to the page that are going to oppose the goals of the protagonist and turn challenges into actual conflict? So begin to think through your 3 ideas and just brainstorm some of those people. You don't need it set in stone yet. Next week, we're going to take the time to actually pick one idea and articulate all these different things and really get it set and make sure that everything is exactly where it needs to be. But at this point, I just want you to get the wheels turning. And of course, as your time allows, take the time to watch something. Take the time, if you're reading a book, to begin thinking through how are these character functions represented in this story. And I think that you'll have a lot of fun with that. So join me again tomorrow for day 5, where we'll be talking about the universe. And in the meantime, keep brainstorming. Keep doing the hard work now, because it's going to pay off big time once you get into that writing in about a week from now. So be blessed and happy writing.